Hi, my name is Emily Rivera, and welcome to Giant Steps Press Go Zoom. Today we have with us author and scholar David Cope. Thank you for joining me today, David.
Thank you.
No problem. So your new book just came out, The Correspondence of David Cope and Allen Ginsberg, dated 1976 to 1996. So from my experience learning about Allen Ginsberg from Randy Rourke, Kirpal Gordon, Steve Hirsch, and now you, David, I've seen that there is much to like and possibly dislike about Allen. And him and his work seem to challenge political, sexual, and aesthetic beliefs back in the day. That he was a poet whose work would kill fascists, to use the motto that Woody Guthrie put on his guitar. Does your book contribute to this view? Does it break it down? What side of Allen do we see in your book?
Quite a few. The primary focus is personal growth, kindness, compassion, building a community of poets, though the political flashpoints do appear at times. And I'll give you some examples. Our dialogue on the Beirut bombing and Grenada invasion of 1983 is covered on pages 87 to 88 with notice of Emerson's great ode to W.H. Channing, in which he berated the United States for its aggression. The second one was my republication of Allen's early statement, Poetry, Violence, and the Trembling Lambs, which is on page 74. The collaborative document we produced after Allen's appearance at Grand Rapids Community College, where I taught. One would see the ATC lectures, paragraphs 1 to 4 on pages 104 and 105. I can read a couple of those paragraphs to illustrate it if you want.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so let me get back to that page. I got a couple places where it probably would be smart to read. There's 4 paragraphs that deal with it. And this was on February 19, 1993. This was an interesting document. I took all the notes for the document, and then Alan and I sat together before he left on the jet plane for his next reading. And we did corrections on this thing together. He corrected a few things that I had slightly wrong. So it's really a collaborative document, which I'm very proud of. So this is the ATC lectures from between 1 and 3. So here's the first paragraph, and then I'll read the fourth. Alan spoke to a packed auditorium, mostly students and professors, but with a few press reporters and local poets. In the first hour, Alan chanted the Prana Paramita Sutra and spoke about his political concerns, reading from his New Democracy Wish List, which was earlier published in the New York Newsday. He stated that hyper-rationalization, hyper-industrialization, and hyper-technology create chaos. This was a basic principle, and of course you can see it in the climate change we have right now. Citing military industrial complexes, worldwide pollution, hyper economies that place profit before the planet's real needs as examples of the principle. So you notice that he's really taking a strong, ecologically responsible perspective and putting the blame where it lies.
Yeah.
He also focused his concerns about censorship. I'm not going to talk about that too much, but censorship, and claimed that only the freedom to say what one thinks will restore sanity to governments and societies across the globe. So, do you know who J. Edgar Hoover was?
No, I don't.
He was for a long time head of the FBI. He was secretly gay, and yet he would go after people who were openly gay, along with a lot of other terrible things about him. They might have named a building after him, but he was a villain. Citing J. Edgar Hoover as an example, he showed how fear of revealing one's true self can distort national priorities and create a complex web of denial in which crime and homophobic behavior flourish. So that was paragraph 1. I'll give you this paragraph 2 if you've got time for me to do that.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Or this is paragraph 4, actually. He later answered questions about fundamentalist Christianity and balancing the literary canon. Allen first separated fundamentalists into 2 groups: libertarian fundamentalists and a group he labeled as Stalinists. who have tried to deny me my fundamental right to speak my mind. He pointed out that this second group, which includes the likes of Senator Jesse Helms, who is a terrible, nasty Republican, um, presents an agenda using language remarkably similar to the language used by Nazis, Stalinists, and Maoists, in that all four have attempted to, quotes, impose their absolutist views on others, and censor freedom of expression by claiming that those whose works they disagree with are examples of spiritual corruption practiced by degenerate individualists. I'm not going to go into the next part of it, but you get the picture at that point where um, Ed Sanders, a great poet who was also the lead singer of the Fugs. I don't know if you're familiar with them or not.
No, I've never listened to them.
They were a really wild band in the 60s and 70s. Steven Taylor, Alan's guitar player, also played guitar for them in their latter days. But great lyrics and really funny sense of humor, even as they're being very political. So anyways, how did I get off on them? Here we go again. Let me go on from there then. Ed talked about the idea that I like these little hiccups in my speech, if you don't mind. It's the true way I am. Ed talked about how Alan was and the other beats were the ones who realized that there were in our governmental documents language close enough or open enough to where there was a possibility of what he called oodles of free speech that was not being used. And Alan basically set out to challenge those limits. And of course, Howell was the target of that and got terrible reviews from a lot of academic reviewers and political hacks and all the rest of it. So what Kerpel and the others have been talking about was absolutely true. There's other things that in the book that, and there's only a couple more. I don't want to go too long, but I'll throw it to you and holler if you got a question. This book covers the planning work for the 1990 Eco-Poetics Conference at Naropa Institute, or university as it's now called. I was a committed environmentalist as early as 1970 when they had the first Earth Day celebrations at American universities, and mine was one of the premier ones at U of M. But anyways, I saw the need for this because there had so many things had gone wrong. I proposed that conference, and I had two different lineups that I thought would be good ones for that conference. And I sent the first one to Ann Waldman, and then the second one I sent to Alan, along with the first one that I sent to Ann Waldman. They were two somewhat different programs. And I knew that neither one of them would be kept as they were, that they would be up to Naropa to take over the ball. And Ann immediately saw the intelligence of it and ran with it. And we had this wonderful conference that had earth scientists and eco-activists and crazy poets and all sorts of other people there. We had a wonderful time. I wrote the document that was at the heart of that conference, the Declaration of Interdependence, which was later published at the in the book on Naropa at the University of New Mexico Press. So I'm proud of that. And what's interesting to me, if I put it in terms of contemporary politics, it proposes an earth awareness and platform for action to address issues that we saw rolled back quite viciously by the Trump administration. So this is still a current thing, probably more so. I feel at this point that we are now in the middle of our last chance to address the climate crisis and to curb the addiction to environmental poisons that standard human activities contribute to climate change. Mm-hmm. So there's politics even in that, in a different kind of way from what you saw in the 50s. So, and also, yeah, go ahead.
Quick question. So did you meet Alan through your planning of this program or at the school?
Well,
how did you
a lot we talked about things like this and the Objectivist Conference and the Beats and Other Rebel Angels Conference and other projects that we did together. It was part of our dialogues, and that's what the book does. It really documents all of those dialogues we had, and the payoff was when we all got to meet at the conference and work together. And the one thing I loved, you know, the Objectivist Conference, some of the Objectivists were already dead. Karl Rakosi was there, and the widow of Charles Resnikoff was there. But they had me read with Karl Rakosi, who at that time was 80 years old. I was 40, and Alan was 60. We'd have breakfast every morning. But God, I could tell you stories about that too, but I'm not gonna. Karl became a friend, of course, and I had seen him earlier in 1973 at the National Poetry Festival when the three major objectivists all met together. There's a picture of that, a couple pictures of that at the front of the book. 1973 National Poetry Festival in Allendale, Michigan, which is about 15 miles from my house. The other thing I did want to touch on was the business of diversity, cultural diversity, and such, which is right now is a real flashpoint for the Republicans. They think it's anti-American. I had begun developing, well, actually I was talking to Alan and other people, developing a multicultural literature class, which was put online and became part of online's not the right word now, but it was made a regular course at my college. I had just become a full-time professor with the guarantee that I would finish my master's degree, which I did tout sweet, later getting 30 more credits beyond that. But that diversity thing was part of what my college did, because GRCC is an interesting college. It caters to not only really smart kids who either didn't have money to go to the big four-year schools or didn't know how to get scholarships, or people that had screwed around in high school and gotten in trouble, et cetera, et cetera. It was their chance to find a way back onto the thing that would create success for them. I was one of those latter ones. I couldn't go to the University of Michigan, which is my family's school. There's 4 generations who've been there. There's, 14 graduates now. And my grades in high school were terrible, and I'd gotten in trouble so much that probably most people wouldn't want me anyway. I've spent half my all the pep assemblies for the whole 4 years in detention, but more stories than that. But at GRCC, what they do is they give you that chance, and they give you very personal attention to help you succeed, so that you can get your grades up high enough and transfer at the end of your second year to the school you want to go to, or to train you for tech jobs and jobs like that. So it was like a social justice school is the way I always thought of it. And we have a higher percentage of different ethnic groups and races at our school than any place in all of Western Michigan, I think, including English as a second language for African, Bosnian, and other immigrants who come to Grand Rapids and get their start there. So anyways, we have a great diversity center too. Don't get me started on that. I'm not working anymore, but I still love the place. Anyway, so I had the multicultural lit class at about the same time as Alan was beginning to introduce Black, Latino, and other people, Latinx, is it now? Anyways, and other poets that were out of the so-called mainstream, to give them a platform in order to be heard. And we had a lot of talk back and forth about that. And then I went to the people at my college and worked on that too. So that diversity thing was something we got into very, very early, both of us. And of course, he was a little bit ahead of me, but not much. So that's what I would say in terms of the political question. It's a big one. Some of these are a lot easier than others for me. I can do a list on some of them, I think, but with this one, it was open a can of worms. I guess I'd say on some level. I hope I answered it to everybody's satisfaction.
Yeah, you
Any
did.
questions?
Yeah, so my question is, how did your correspondence with Alan start? Like, how did you meet him and start writing letters with him?
Okay. Well, I have to go back to the '73 conference, and before that, I had was it my junior or senior year? Anyways, I had as a young teenager, I was angry at the whole world. My father had cheated on my mother and got married to another woman and went off and had a different life. And by that point, I was angry at every human male in the whole world that was older than me. And it was part of what got me in trouble. And uh, it didn't help because my mother wasn't the best person in the world. She was as angry as I was, and I was feeding off of her anger. She never did recover from it. But in 1973, if we put this historically in perspective, um, by 1969, the anger of people, actually before that, in the civil rights movement, it started off with Martin King's nonviolent direct action. And eventually it turned into, because the police and other people would beat up the demonstrators. John Lewis is a prime example on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. A lot of people got sick of that because they realized these people weren't going to respect you because you were standing up for what was right. They were going to beat you half to death and then throw you in jail and then charge you with a crime. And finally, a lot of people my age just said, enough of this shit. And they went out there and started swinging back. And we had riots all over the country that way. And uh, my first experience of it, I'd seen it happen in Grand Rapids in 66, 65, something like that, on Division Street, of all the names of a street for that to happen, where they had to call in Vietnam veterans who'd been come back from Nam and put them on the street along with National Guard and the others to quell the rioters, as they called it. Of course, there's the Great Detroit Rebellion, which was always called the riots. And if you go to Detroit, you'll get a different picture of it at the museum there. But anyways, uh, we all had succumbed to the sort of anger we were trying to prevent. And in '73, Alan came in with the idea of, we need to rethink what we've experienced over the last 10 years. And we really had a conference where we talked very much about that whole business of trying to align ourselves with the original idea of compassion and kindness. And that was the second time actually that Alan changed my life. The first time was when I read Howl, where he basically said to the troubled young people, um, it's okay to feel what you feel. If you're angry about something, you have to live with it until you're tired of it. And everything that lives is holy was in the last lines of it. In a way, that speaks a very universal message. We've been talking off and on about that whole idea of your generation. Probably starts with that. I mean, kids that had horrible lives. Alan's a complex writer, but on the other hand, he speaks of very basic things. Okay, so I'm getting off the track at this point. So I hope I answered your question okay, but um, it was a difficult time, and we had to find our way past it.
Yeah. So Alan, as you depicted Alan as someone who like speaks up for himself and is very vocal about these things, how do you see your book in depicting him and like overall your view?
Okay, so yeah, how do I see my book depicting him and me? I think it'd be a better way.
Yeah.
I see it as a celebration, a documentation of a very wide arc in my life as a poet. I'm talking 20 years of my formative life as a professional poet, and that was important. As I've mentioned several times in different places, it's also a Bildungsroman, which is a literary form of really a dialogue between a younger writer and an older writer, or a younger person and an older person, in which the older person serves as the person to challenge the young one to wake up, to find a new way. The young one sometimes does good things for the older person too. Um, the education of the young poet's mind is what they call it when they're talking about people like Rainer Maria Rilke, the German poet, who had a Letters to a Young Poet book. So it is a Bildungsroman in that sense. It is in the growth of my own generation of poets that he helped birth, I guess you'd say. As Ed Sanders once said, uh, the first line of Alan's Howl is, "I saw the best minds of my generation starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn, looking for an angry fix." Um, Ed said, "Seek out the best minds of your generation." And in a way, Alan helped me find people that I would never have met otherwise, who were gifted writers, who were very different from each other, but who all respected each other's talents. So the growth of my generation of poets, it's a primer of reading other writers as a central idea here. I mean, the one thing, if you go through the index, there's an enormous number of writers we talked about and yacked about and carried on and all the rest of that. Alan used to keep lists of books that he read when he was a young kid, so that he knew that he was reading. So, and they still have copies of that in one of the journals, where you really get the sense that he's probably reading 5 books at one time, and that's what I've been doing for like 50 years now. So there's some things are very similar. I'm reading a new translation of Du Fu, the great Chinese master, right now. Um, uh, it's the idea of friendship as being something that is a matter of shared tasks, and probably above all, according to his meditation rag, learning a little patience and generosity of spirit. That's what my book is. It's a learning of that too.
So, what you meant by the growth concept that you started
Mhm.
the interview with is that's awesome. That's really cool that you got to meet all these people and get impacted.
Well, yeah, I look at people like Andy Clausen or Antler. There were 3 of us that were the primary people he promoted. Um, we're very different from each other,
Yeah.
personally and otherwise. But at the same time, there's nobody I'd rather be on stage with except maybe Jim Cohen or James Ruggia. There's a couple others. I'd be afraid to share a stage with Ann Waltman. She's such a fireball, although I did once. But pardon me?
I said, "Oh, really? That's cool."
Yeah, when they had the closing the Bardo ceremony, which is actually in the coda of the book, and a lot of us went out to read at Hill Auditorium in Ann Arbor. Alan, by that point, had come to the University of Michigan every spring, where he and the Patti Smith band would put on a show to raise money for Gallic Rinpoche and the Jewel Heart community in Ann Arbor and elsewhere. And that was how I got to know Gallic too. But he died that year. So instead, it was all of us, and they had everybody from what was that? There was a young woman who was the lead singer for 10,000 Maniacs way back when, in the 90s. Not coming to me now. Anyways, there was her. There were monks that chanted. There was uh, Detroit classical music quartet that came out. They used to perform with Alan when he was in that part of town, and I'll never forget they did one of his songs, poems, and the violin took the lead, and it was just eerie how beautiful it was. And then Bob Rosenthal came out. He did the photograph on the cover of the book, but he's also Alan's executive secretary all those years. Probably knew him better than anybody. But Bob came out and did some of Alan's last poems, and he was great. And I got to read my Elegy for Alan too. So hope that answered you okay.
Yes.
Any more?
Yes. So moving on to the next question about generational access. How can my generation, Gen Z, and the millennials find access and meaning in Alan and yours works?
Well, I've already covered some of the stuff, the whole business that he's dealt with the very issues that are in their prime right now.
Yeah.
Environment, climate change, cultural diversity, all those types of things, which in some ways your generation is the beneficiary of the things we did. In some ways you have to pick up the ball and take it to the next level, which is another thing. I have two sorts of answers with this. And I still don't know if I've got to the whole part of it, but first of all, there are some younger poets who came to me and others because they knew that our connection to Alan. They had been reading him, and they either him or Charles Reznikoff, the older objectivist poet. So I found they turned up in my mailbox and started wanting to talk to me. And next thing you know, I'm publishing them, and they were publishing me. John Daubacher, who's a California poet who's now living in Chicago. He's also a theater director and actor. Chicago's a great place to be a theater director now that the pandemic's gone. There's David Kubik, who's down in Ohio. Both of them came to me. Noah David Roberts, who came to Andy Clausen, who sent him to me. So there are some that have already turned up, and there will be others. I don't have quite the venue to attract people that are younger now that Big Scream is done, because I closed my magazine. Someone's got to pick up somewhere and do that. The other one was my experience with Jane's students. There's my book, Howl in Chicago, where Jane was teaching these really bright, not particularly literate, but bright students in a tough high school in Chicago. And she wanted to introduce them to Howl, and she got to it, and I was like, Dad, I'm not sure how to go after this. And I said, well, I'll take the train down and we'll do it together. She thought that was a great idea. So I turned up at her high school. They were clueless about what the poem did until I started bringing up contemporary events that were similar. And they were aware of some of those events, and in others they weren't so much. And basically we wound up having a discussion. I don't think we ever got past the first 6 pages of the poem. But it was a great learning experience for everybody. So I think teachers who are going to teach that thing have to be willing to go the extra mile in 50 different ways. There's also the problem of, as with T.S. Eliot or Ezra Pound or some of the other great poets, Dante primarily, or Shakespeare, Alan is very complicated in terms of his use of literary allusions to other works, to history, historical events, and the rest of that. If you don't know that stuff, you're not going to fully get what he did. So in my case, what it was, if I look at it, it began with, I wanted to know this guy because his book opened my heart, made me think about things. And when he would talk about taking the last boat across Lethe, and some of the other different kinds of references that were in there, I went to the library and I would look that stuff up, and I kept doing it, and I went very slowly through the whole book or the whole poem so that I could get what he was doing. Most people today aren't even trained, in some schools anyways, in how to do literary research of that caliber. When you get up to graduate school, it's kind of forced on you if you're in literature or English, but you have to have really a deep commitment that comes from already being emotionally stirred by it. So what I've got here is the poem, Alan's poem. You need a personal commitment to the poem itself, first of all, for some reason. It speaks to those who are struggling with personal issues. The willingness to work tirelessly to research many cultural and historical references. Commitment to poetry, both writing and scholarship. and a need for friendship with like-minded others. I just have one other thing to say, and I'll let you take over with questions if you've got some. Um, Dante is the Dante Alighieri of Italy, Florence, Italy, from 1265 to 1321. His Divine Comedy. Most people know the Inferno, but there's three parts of that poem. Um, he wrote a great poem that was a heroic journey through the afterlife, is what it came right down to find what the meaning of love was. Um, uh, the love that circles the sun and the other stars, as he ends each canticle with it. But he's writing a thing where the drama of what he is showing you between the characters and the situations they find themselves in can be understood by someone with no cultural background. It's a great adventure tale. And I suppose on some other level, it's an interesting tale for someone who's committed to religion. Although he got in trouble because the Pope at one point had both Thomas Aquinas and him sort of on the hot list as people not to read. But that's another tale. The thing that's interesting was, as I grew older, I kept coming back to it in more and more deep ways until finally I was at my master's plus 30. I was doing a lot of work on English drama because that was my main area well, looking for my PhD. And Dante, who continues to this day to be a major point of interest for me, because you can read this guy 50 times and you still won't get all of it. There's just so many different levels that it exists on besides just that adventure story you start with. And that's a real gift. So that if you're ignorant, when he was coming along, uh, workers in the streets of Florence were singing lines from his poem because they, were going after this bad guy or that bad guy that they couldn't stand either. And of course they knew it. From those kind of people up to the PhDs of today and some of the most brilliant minds among the academics there are. So there's a way to do it, but it's tricky. You
Yeah.
got more questions? Comments?
Yeah. I mean, commenting on what you just said, I think I took AP Lit in high school, and
Hmm.
so we were taught how to like dissect works and figure out the meaning
Yeah,
behind it.
AP is a good thing.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun, and Frankenstein was the first piece where I was like, "Whoa, there's so many meanings behind it." But I'll
Hmm.
never forget there was one book we were reading, and there was a section that was in another language, and I translated it because I was like, I don't know what the language is. Like, I want to know what's happening because obviously it was
Hmm.
important enough to change whatever language it was. So
Yeah,
I translated it and I talked to my teacher about it, and he's like, "What? Like, nobody ever does that. That's crazy." So I think your point of really
hmm,
getting into the work and
yeah,
dissecting it and taking it down and researching to figure out what Alan is trying to say in his piece is
yeah.
really important.
My son was a student of Gothic literature when he was in college, and he always felt the woman in Frankenstein was the hero, not Van Helsing, because she's the one that figured it out.
Yeah, that's really
Okay.
okay. So next question. In your interview with Kurt Paul in 2016, you mentioned that in your February 10th letter, how your mentor-mentee relationship usually breaks down in alienation with your
Hmm.
desire to be careful to make it a lasting friendship.
Hmm.
So there's a theme of friendship and rapport and professional
Hmm.
relationship you created with Alan, and you
Hmm.
made use of his remarkable talent and mentioned the struggle between mentorship and friendships that could arise. And I was
Yeah,
wondering if that impacted your relationship with him, and if it did, how did you work through that?
not really. I'd been reading a lot of psychology at the time, and because I'm always dipping into different fields, and that whole business of the breakdown into alienation was in some article, and I raised the issue in the letter because I wanted him to know I wanted to be a friend, not to just treat him as someone I could suck information out of.
Yeah.
And I didn't put it that way, but that's pretty much what I was concerned about. Is I wanted to be a friend. So I raised the issue. We worked together, and we found out we worked pretty well, and we became friends. As far as the did you fix the strife? There was no strife actually. It was basically a matter we just picked up where we were. He didn't even respond to my question, and we had shared tasks, and we just kept piling it on more and more and more to that type of thing. So I was lucky because he was aware of my gifts as a writer and as a researcher. So in fact, if you look at the thing he wrote for publishers and later on for my PhD entrances, you know, where you have a recommendation, and then what eventually became the forward to my first book, was talking about my gifts as a writer. And then there's a second part later on that he added to that for the PhD thing about my advanced scholarship, which by that point was pretty evident. I think it's important that no matter what your relationships are, if there's a power differential, one should trust in the tenacity of kindness and the deep love of one's work. My daughter Anne's going through this right now. They transferred her to a new bank, and the new administrator there was not one who was following the rules by the book at the time. And Anne came home after the second day and she said, I got to get out of here. This is terrible. I'm used to this. And you can lose your job if you don't follow the rules in a bank. And I didn't push it on her because the thing I found with my kids is sometimes they're not looking for answers. They're raising an issue and they want your sympathy or they want your friendship in that area. They'll find them themselves. And my kids are really independent kids. Anne came back at the end of the first week and I said, well, how's it going? She said, pretty good. I sat down with them and said, I'm not sure how you do things, but I'm going to follow the book because that's the way I was taught to do it. And the guy said, okay. So that solved that problem. And she found that she really likes the customers at the new bank because they're not a bunch of harried idiots the way they are over in the mall where the other bank it was. So just a little example of that kind of thing, but tenacity of kindness and deep love of one's work. I think that's important. Okay. Anything? Is that answer okay?
Yeah, that was good.
Okay.
I remember last time we talked about it, you mentioned like the collaborative mindset of working through those issues and making sure that you're open and honest about it. So
collaboration is very important to me. It's basically the way I ran the editing of my magazine for what, 47 years. The poets would send me the stuff. I would select what was there. If I had some comments that I wanted them to consider, I would put them on. And I said, but the end game here is you make the final choice. So they're editing their own work with my cooperation and collaborating, you know. So I made a hell of a lot of friends that way because I wasn't an asshole about being an editor. At least I don't think I was. Okay, what's next?
So the next question is, I heard that allegedly Alan did LSD back in the day, but it opened like a spiritual side of him, and he went to Congress to like break down the effects of the drug since not many knew about it. Did you experience Alan on LSD or the spiritual side, or like what was he like?
Well, we all did LSD in the 60s, and there was a point where I had to get away from it. It was a long giggle, but at the same time, one of the things I noticed was it made you fuzzy for a couple of weeks afterwards because you had expended so much of your psychological energy while you were on the high. It is true that one of Alan's greatest poems, Whale's Visitation, was written while tripping on acid. He's got it right at the end of the poem, LSD. So, and it's a wonderful piece of work. I mean, you get to it, and it's a knockout poem, is all I can say. For the spiritual side, I've got two things here. It was, as I pointed out, in every interaction between us, compassion, kindness, shared experiences with his Lama, Gelik Rinpoche. And I've got a little bit here I want to read to you about Gelik because he was a special guy. We just talked about that on Facebook, actually, in the R. Allen thing here. There's a Facebook, what do you call it? one of those sites where you can go to and all these people share the same thing. Our Alan is all these poets, younger and older, that get on there and chip in about what they've seen, get pictures, recite things that they've experienced, and we all talk back and forth. This is from the letter to Jim Cohn on 25 May 1997. It was the closing the Bardo ceremony in Buddhism at the end of, I think it's 49 days. It might be 47, I can't remember. The spirit of the dead person wanders in the Bardo, which is like a plane between life and death, for about those 49 days. And at the end of that time, in Buddhism, they have a ceremony, which is closing the Bardo. And that is allowing that person to go where they need to be. So this letter kind of recites all of the things that happened at that ceremony, which I felt was such an important thing in Alan's life or death, and certainly in my own. And I wanted to share it with Jimmy because Jim Cohn was one of Alan's TAs and his piano tuner when they first met. And Jim and I are sort of like spiritual brothers ourselves. Both of us came from really difficult backgrounds, and we both sort of transcended it and found a way to be who we are. I call him my blood brother. But anyways, so I was talking about the warm-up, and I came to do my sound check for this reading, which was going to have about 1,400 people in the audience. And I'll start with this May 24 show was scheduled before Alan got sick. He and Patty Smith were going to again raise money for Gallic Rinpoche and the Jewel Heart community. They did this every year so that it would help support that Buddhist community. He did all kinds of giveaways, and it's another story. So I wrote, as I finished my sound check, Gallic and the Gyoto monks arrived and sat down to do theirs. He recognizing me immediately from my visits to Alan backstage and from my visit at the Gun Lake retreat where we sat and he gave lectures on the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism. Big smile, thanking me for coming to be a part. I sensed a tentativeness about him that I hadn't seen before. He and Alan had been partners in the enterprise of Jewel Heart, but right from the first time I saw them together, it's a little dark in here now. First time I saw them together, I noted that they genuinely enjoyed each other's company, like real, true spiritual brothers. And this day I saw Gallic's vulnerability at the loss. It was a beautiful, tender thing, the master's grief, like a single cloud on a bright sky, yet never clouding his attentiveness. And the guy was he was with you all the way. He could have that cloud on his sky, but he wasn't going to get in the way. And I love that guy. And we were talking on our Alan, poets from across the country were commenting about what a great man he was, and he was. So Alan got lucky that way with those guys. But so I don't know, is there anything else about LSD or any of the other stuff, spirituality? The spiritual thing was part of what attracted me to him. I mean, he was often called a prophet, which you can look back at those long lines of some of his poems, and they're derived not only from Whitman's Song of Myself, which had long lines, and a lot of Whitman's did, but both of them are really related back to the prophets of the Bible, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and that crowd. The problem with Bibles is they try to jam them into double columns. Those are long line poems. And you don't see it unless you get someone who's attentive to what they actually were. Yeah. So anyways, that's another one. So go ahead.
Well, thank you for sharing that poem. It was really beautiful. I teared up a little bit. I was like, oh. Yeah. But your book also shows a life in poetry. So what were your hopes in terms of the book, in terms of scholarship?
Okay, so a couple things. Send the work out and let it go. Write the poem in a little piece of paper, fold it into a boat and send it downstream, and whoever needs it will get it. But if it speaks to future generations, so be it. I don't have any command over this sort of thing. I really don't have any hopes. The only thing I wanted to do in my career was to be true to my own vision, and I think I did that. Um, Secondly, if the works were to survive, and I actually have faith that some young scholar somewhere will see that. If the work were to survive, it is thoroughly, and I do mean thoroughly, documented in the David Cope papers at the University of Michigan Special Collections Resource Center. Only the work from 1972 to 2013 is on the finding aid, but there's an enormous group of papers that eventually will be uploaded and take me right through to the end of my career. So at this point, I think I'm at 22.5 linear feet where they stand up the papers on end and, do a count of the pages.
Yeah.
It's not that big. I mean, Ann Waldman's, I think at last count was about 75 or 80. And I don't know what Allen's, that's probably 2050 or something. But the neat thing about my papers is other people's papers are there too. It's a very rare thing. If you're looking for Resnikov's papers, he's in San Diego and a couple other places, California, even though he was a New Yorker. A lot of the other beats, they're in this special collections library or that one. I'm in the same library with Ann Waldman, her papers, Jim Cohn, Detroit and Rochester poet Benvola Drury, who is a dear friend. Her son George is now a school teacher in Chicago and a good poet too. Then Ken Michalowski, who is from Ann's generation, was a poet in residence at Michigan in the particular school that my daughter was in. So there's four of us, and we've talked all our lives back and forth in one way or another, and we'll be able to check all four papers in the same area as far as that goes. And so finally, I guess the last question is, I have faith that some young scholar will find it and pass it on to others. I just don't worry about it. Just be true to myself.
Okay. That's really cool though that it's the feat of how high the stack goes. I didn't know they did that.
Yeah. Yeah, not everybody thinks in terms of legacies or places to get your stuff put in. In fact, it's odd. I was talking to Joanne Kiger, who was Gary Snyder's first wife, great poet. I always called her a Zen archer when she was in front of the audience because it was like she put that diamond hard compassion right into your heart. About 2 seconds, bam, it's there. But she had it was either her or one of the others out west had stored all of their papers in big boxes in a what would you call it, a shed in the back of the property. Of course, it's you do that and it's like that, it's open to the weather, the rain, all the rest of that humidity. And I wanted to put it in a safe place. And at Michigan, all my stuff is in climate controlled areas so that it'll last for hundreds of years, and which a good archive always does have. And my curators have taught me a great deal about being a librarian. I think I mentioned at one point in the book that I think I missed my calling. So, okay, anything else?
Um, Not topic, but you talk about the postcard poem a lot that Alan sent you from China on November 4th, 1985. And it seems like that's quite an important piece for you. Could you explain why?
Yeah, it's a history of different publications in some ways. So he sent it as a postcard prose message to me from China to let me know what he was doing. And I saw it immediately as a tightly written poem because there's not a word in there that doesn't count in the objectivist style. I asked to publish it as a poem suggesting format changes. This is mine of November 84, and then again mine of January 2485, both in the book, announcing publication in Big Scream 20. So I published it in Big Scream 20, but unbeknownst to me, and this is where when you get something published, you never know where it's going to wind up going. Alan had Big Scream 20 somewhere on his table in his apartment. And my future translator, Zhang Qing of Nanjing University, saw the poem in Big Scream 20 and then later published it in a journal in China. The poem later appeared in his magnum opus, A History of 20th Century American Poetry, and I've got that here. There's 3 volumes to this thing. You can see that it's a monster book.
Yeah.
And if I go to page 13, what is it, 13, 12, and 13, 13, you probably can't see it very well. Gotta get the right one here, dummies. But anyway, I'm talking about myself. 13, 12, and 13, 13. You probably can't see it here, but this is the beginning of the poem here. Can you? Well, anyways, you get it. This is the Chinese version and the translation he did for this book. And it's part of it, introducing my generation of poets, American poets, to Allen's good graces in Zhang's book. And it's odd because Zhang met me through Allen, and then Allen, long gone, must be laughing his ass off somewhere because Zhang picked me up, and he's been as big of an influence on the latter part of my career as Allen was in the first part. That's another story. So then later, because Zhang had published 9 of my poems in translation in the biggest, the most important literary journal in China, I was invited by the people of the Suining in Sichuan to participate in their annual conference of international poets. And what they were looking for was they wanted to hear what the international poets had to say to the Chinese poets that were there, that would make it easier for them to become part of the international community of poets. It's happening right now. Wang Ping and some others are working on it, and I did too. But that's another tale. So anyways, I went to Suining. I had never thought of it. I'd ever go to China. You know, John Lennon always talked about going to China in one of his songs in later days. Of course, he never did because there was still a war between us and all that. So I took that 13-hour trip on the plane, scared the hell right out of me. I don't like flying, and take a train any day. But I landed in Beijing, and of course, there's no signs there in English, and you had to sort of bumble around. I had a Chinese policewoman that helped me find a place where I could pick up a train to get a taxi, you know, that type of thing. But and then I took Air China down to Chengdu, which is the capital of Sichuan province. It's also the place where Du Fu, China's greatest poet, had his thatched hut refuge for 2 years of his life. It's part of this important part of his career. And so I resolved when I came back that way after the conference, I wanted to go to that. I figured out a way to do it too. But anyways, the people from Suining turned up in a car, and I rode 150 miles down to Suining, China. They set us up in a nice hotel, and they had a regular program where we had to talk about poetry on some days, and other days we would visit cultural attractions. So we started off going to the Temple of Guanyin at the far end of the city. It was up on Wolong Mountain, and we had to climb for 3 hours to get to the top. And it was really weird. Guanyin is the female form of the god of compassion, of Avalokitesvara, was the male form. But I was always devoted to her. I always thought she was something. When I first encountered her, she's also known as Kwanan or Kuan-Yin and lots of other names in different cultures. And when I realized they thought she and her sisters grew up in that town, I thought to myself, how the hell do I wind up in a town in China which is her hometown? So I climbed to the top of it with this Dutch poet. The 2 of us kind of were determined to go all the way. And you could see all of the whole city of about 2 million people spread at our feet. And that was one of the weird things about China was, you know, you'd see these 2 million and 3 million people cities, and it was like, God, that's a big city. For them, that's a medium-sized city. Beijing was running at about 23 million at the time. Shanghai was even more. And a lot of the other places were just enormous, or giant circle roads everywhere. And their technology is so much farther advanced than ours. That was one thing I just kept looking at. They got high speed bullet trains and all sorts of other stuff. I would love to have taken those, but I didn't. So, anyways, um, John helped me get to this place, and then I had a journal, and I'll put that one up right here. Hope I can get that all on there. Maybe not. Pull it back a bit. That's Chen Zhang on the cover. He's the forerunner of the Tang poets Renaissance, and he was also one that they counted as one of their people. This is a bridge across the Pacific, lays for Zhenjiang, Guanyin, and Dufu. And basically, I wrote an essay about how they wanted us to write an essay of this, and it's like bridges across the Pacific, words across the waters, which was really showing how I got involved. It leads off with Alan's postcard poem right here in English. And then Zhang, I asked him, and he gave me his poem in Chinese. So it's in the same book. And then finally, years after that, I'm sorry to keep showing books, but in a way, it's what it is. Bill Morgan published a book by Alan called Wait Till I'm Dead. These are poems that he wanted to see published, but he didn't want to be alive to have to do it. And it turned out that poem turned up in that book on page 185. There's one word that's incorrect. It ends with ocean here, and it should be years, but that's a minor thing. So there's this long publishing history the poem had. There's the importance of it to my own life because the poem has a whole variety of things that are going on in it, but in the end, Gary Snyder, who was one of Alan's best friends, still alive. He just won a big award, and Wang Ping, my dear friend from Minneapolis, flew out there to be with him, and they had a traditional Chinese meal together along with other people. And Gary talked and carried on. He was wearing his turd shirt. It was a shirt that had all different kinds of animal turds on it. He's an environmentalist to the first order. But anyways, lost my train of thought here. It's typical. But what I felt was important here was at the end of the postcard poem, he meets up with Gary, who was in China at the time, and they went to visit the mountaintop home of Han Shan, who is one of the great Chinese poets from the period. Gary had been the premier translator of Han Shan back in the early 60s. It was published, I think, by New Directions at the time. Of course, he's probably got it published with Counterpoint now, but I liked the way that it ended because it was like they were completing a life circle. They had begun as young men having their own interests and some somewhat different attitudes about their poems and all the rest, but still loving each other's gifts. And Gary was really committed to Buddhism on a deeper level than anyone except maybe Phil Whalen of that original group of beads. Alan came to it a little later. He started off with Hinduism and, of course, his Jewish background. But it's almost as though they make the great journey of their lives, and it ends with coming back to where they began. That was something that really moved me, and that's what I loved about the poem, and I loved seeing it have all these different venues and people talking about it and the rest of that. So that's what that poem's about for me. It's completing the circle, and in a way, that's what this book is completing the circle.
Is there
Yeah, go ahead.
Is there a poem that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, I got one. I picked a shorter one this time around because I was afraid I'd go on too long with the other. I love the other poem, but this is my last book with Humana, which turned the wheel. And there's several elegies for Alan in here. I think this is my favorite of the bunch. This is called Yeah, and Here He Was, leaning down on me with his one eye still full of tears, the other one now gone blind, singing an old Yiddish ballad in my ear like some long gone Yenta come back to find me a boyfriend. I'd been dreaming in this mile-wide field of headstones, the glass pillars and haze beyond, and distant rush hour thunder, wealthy slaves still quoting stocks and haggling in their hopped-up SUVs, whistling while they raced to work. And above them, the raging torrent of dead souls, screaming upward like Roman candles into the mild sky toward the emptiness beyond, pole star and lost sailor alike. Singers of my generation disappeared like evening rain when he left, burrowed into silent meditation in moonlit mountain cabins, working on dreams deferred, hands rough now building invisible stone towers and tearing them down, learning the meaning of silence. A new breed now runs the show, drives the planet ever closer to Mammon's nightmare circus, buying to save themselves from themselves, never looking back, racing like mad horses for some lost nowhere horizon. Once we'd thought to howl them back, yet there they go, ears ringing with cash registers and cell phones, hearts no longer heavy with the grief of loss. There are light moments when one may sing with long dead friends, watch dreams walk lightly from the living tomb. So a couple references in this poem that are sort of hidden, if you don't mind. Let's see, what my generation, working on dreams deferred, that's a reference from Langston Hughes' great poem, What Do You Make of a Dream Deferred? What happens to it? Hands now rough, building invisible stone towers and tearing them down. Milarepa, who is one of the great Tibetan saints, he was kind of like St. Paul in his own way, a great sinner, persecutor of others. He was refused to learn the skills of a shaman. And so he went to a magician, I guess is what they call it, and he learned some very bad magic. Killed 35 of his relatives who tried to disinherit his mother. So he, basically his anger at people in the family, which I can sort of relate to that. He never wanted to kill anybody, but he went to Marpa, who was a different kind of a saint. He was a farmer who worked his fields day and night, had a wife and children, and cared for them. People came to him and they would have their dialogues and they would learn from him. So Milarepa came in and Marpa wouldn't talk to him at first. And finally he went to him and said, build me a stone tower over here. And he made him gather all these rocks and he built this great big tower. And once he got done, he was very proud and he came back, showed it to Marpa and Marpa said, tear it down. What? Tear it down. And he did. He obeyed him. And then Marpa said, okay, now build it back up again. And what are you doing to me? That type of thing. And this happened 3 times. Third time, I was like, okay, what's the point of this lesson? He said, I wanted to see if you would do what you're supposed to do when you're commanded to do so. And it was like that was his ticket. And he had to do penance, of course, for all the things he had done during his dark stage. So he went up into the mountains of Tibet and lived in a cave for the rest of his life and ate nettles to the point where he was so skinny he could hardly stand up, and his skin turned green, which I always thought was a really interesting one. Nettles, of course, are very green. And people started showing up because they wanted advice. And what happened is eventually he became renowned as the great saint. And if you're willing to make the trip up on the mountain, you can find your way towards enlightenment too. So that's what building invisible stone towers and tearing them down, learning the meaning of silence, and so on. The rest of it, I think, is pretty much, that's the poem. Yep.
So Alan taught your generation how to do things in a sense, poetry-wise and speaking up and everything. How are you going to carry on that lineage?
Well, I'm an old man now, so I probably have done what I can do. I think this book is sort of like a capstone. I do want to publish collected prose, collected poems, and a later poems book, a group of meditations. But this was the big one in some ways. Um, so carrying on the lineage, honestly following my vision wherever it leads. This is another list. Um, I did publish a new generations of poets from 74 to 2021 and in my magazine, along with recognized masters. So someone who'd never been in print before would find themselves on the page right next to Allen Ginsberg or Charles Bukowski or someone like that, providing them with a venue. And I published over 250 poets during the entire period of the print run. So I think I did pretty well. Maintaining many friendships and dialogues to this day. I've got former students, poet friends, and others, and that's the beauty of Facebook for me, is there are constantly dialogues going on with friends, and sometimes they're, let's go out to have breakfast together and yak with former students and so on. And they've done pretty well for themselves too, by and large. So I maintain many friendships and dialogues to this day. That our Allen site's a wonderful one because there's people you don't get to speak to every day that once were very, very dear, close friends. Steve Silberman, who was Allen's West Coast uh, secretary for a time. He's also a scholar of the Grateful Dead band. And a scholar of autism. He's one of the major voices in that field. He was the one that founded our Allen. Me and a couple others jumped on board, and I first met him. We were at Naropa, and he didn't have a place to stay, and said, "Cope, can I stay with you?" And I said, "Yeah." So we'd stay up all night yakking and carrying on, and learned a lot from each other. So I guess that finally, at the end, there's that business of preparing for the spirit journey that I must make westward into the sunset, going out with a light heart. That's about it. And you got anything else on that or no?
No.
Okay, I think we got one more.
Yeah, I have two more written down.
That's great.
But so you've impacted poetry just like Alan has. So how does this impact the future poetry with how
Okay,
interacted with?
it's kind of a funny question because I can't pull the chains of people that aren't born yet. But I guess it depends on the future poets. I like to think of Allen's line from his poem After Whitman and Resnikoff, which is from the collected poems. Final line of it was, "My poems will gather dust in Kansas libraries. Adolescent teenage boys opening book covers with ruddy hands." That's it. I mean, I hope there'd be some young women poets that would do it too, though. I was involved with feminist studies too. That was one of the other things I did that Allen didn't do. I helped set up the women's studies program at community college when I was there, and actually helped some of the women who wanted to do classes. I was a what would you call it, a how to get your class selected to be an official class, and they're pretty regimented there as far as following the rules of how to get it done. I had already done Shakespeare class and multicultural lit, and so I knew how to do curriculum study. And so I would take these younger people that were members of my staff, and I was like, I helped one. She wanted to do a women's poetry, and so we worked together on that. And there was another one that wanted to do an LGBTQ. It was no plus at that time. Literature class, and that was part of the program. And I developed the Introduction to Women's Studies, which was team taught. And my area of that particular team teaching was social equity, social and business parity, what you have to do in order to get recognition that you need to do in order to get paid properly. And then the sexual harassment thing, I at one time knew quite a bit about sexual harassment law and what the options were for people who had put up with that shit. And both in terms of universities and colleges, and also at businesses. And we would look at these official statements by the companies or the schools and dissect them as to what if they don't follow this rule, that type of thing. So, and that was good. But I also felt that as a man, there were two things. One was I needed to sit through everybody else's teaching times because I wanted to learn what they had to teach me. Even though I'd written the description, it's not the same thing as really knowing it and down deep. So I learned everything from it. I taught it for 2 years with my teams or the teams. But I also knew that as a man, I had to get out of the field because a woman should be doing that thing. It's a women's studies class. So I did what I could to get it off the ground, and then I got the hell out so that someone could take over. And it's gone on to become a gender studies program. And there's all sorts of other things that have gone from there. So I'm pretty happy with what I did.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah.
So my last question for you today is, what is something that Alan taught you that has stuck with you throughout your life?
Be true to yourself. I heard it from many people, but I was so angry. My wife, Sue, had told me a couple of times, I'd never be free until I let go of my anger. But of course, a lot of times a husband won't listen very well to his wife because we're stupid. But there was a point where Alan turned to me when I first met him, where we both knew each other, and I talked about my anger. And he just turned to me and said, "You will never be free until you let go of your anger." And within 2 weeks, I went to my dad and I said, "Dad, I need to meet you and talk with you. I want to clear the air between us. I need you back." And that was probably the most enlightening moment of my life. My dad and I walked about a mile through the forests and dunes out to Lake Michigan. Um, and we talked about just about everything. And I said, "Look, I was your boy at age 10. At age 11, I was a cast off, and I need to find that boy again." And he said, "Let's do it." So it began a dialogue that continued to the point where when he was 70 years old, we went down the Grand Canyon together. I loved him, and there's times where I still feel his presence in my life. And the odd thing was, he was an engineer. He had a business with all sorts of people, and of course, I wasn't living with him. And conservative, really, when you're talking about politics. But when I won that American Academy and Institute of Arts and Letters award in New York, my dad paid for all of us to get on the plane and go with him. We stayed at my uncle's house in was it Massachusetts or one of those states? I don't remember. But drove down to New York to 156th Street where the meeting was going to be. And my dad sat in the audience while I got that award. And God, he was still bragging about it 2 years later. And I never even thought about it. The other thing he did was, even in the time when we didn't get along, my Aunt Frances, who was the eldest of the people of her generation, she was a chemical librarian and a brilliant woman, but she got her master's degree by the time she was 22. And or maybe even sooner, I can't remember. And this was at U of M at a time when women did not get engineering or scientific degrees at all. They were the only ones in the class, and she beat the hell out of everybody. But Frances went to my dad at one point and said, "You got to tell David to let go of that poetry. That crap's never going to pay for his life." And my dad said, "Let him find his own way. Leave him alone." And that was when I began to realize for the first time that he really had my best interests at heart. It's not the same thing as buying presents for somebody. And I learned a lot from him about the proper way to raise your kids. Give them their own interests, let them go. Don't try to talk them out of it. So thankful.
That's awesome.
Hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you for sharing that with me, and thank you for taking us through your book and your insight on
Yeah,
Alan and the lineage on poetry and everything. So thank you,
yeah.
Dave.
Thank you.